when facing e4, rather than classically occupying the center with e5. A hyper-modern approach is to fight for control over the center from the flanks. We're going to examine two openings that share the common kingside fianchetto strategy of g6 and bishop g7, known as the Pirc and Modern defenses. Let's begin our journey by first examining the opening which typically confronts the e4 pawn on the second move, the Pirc defense, starting with d6, controlling the square in front of white's e4 pawn, allowing white to build a healthy two-pawn center with d4. Fully in accordance with hyper-modern strategy, white is allowed to occupy the center when black counterattacks it from a distance, starting with knight f6, threatening the e4 pawn, turning the game into the Pirc, or sometimes referred to as Pirc defense. We can see the value behind playing d6 before attacking white's pawn, as e5 would simply allow black to play d takes e5, preparing a favorable exchange of queens on the d-file. White's most popular and flexible response is knight c3, actively developing the knight while supporting the center. Sometimes players who prefer the Philidor defense use this move order, preparing a quick e5, either immediately or first preparing it with knight b to d7. The signature Pirc move is to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop with g6. White enjoys a central space advantage as well as plenty of flexibility regarding development. White may respond in kind with the kingside fianchetto with g3 and bishop g2, often developing the knight to e2, a subtle positional setup that can be explored. It's also possible to develop more classically with knight f3. Supporting the center, focusing on simple, straightforward development, black's dark-squared bishop enters the action from the g7 square, preparing to exert long-term pressure down the long diagonal. By provoking knight c3 earlier, white is unable to support the d4 pawn with c3, so white will need to protect this pawn with pieces for the time being. One interesting plan for white is to play h3, preventing a possible pin with bishop g4. h3 also prepares to comfortably develop the dark-squared bishop with bishop e3. In this case, the dark-squared bishop cannot be harassed by a possible knight g4. On the other hand, if white is simply focusing on simple, straightforward development, it's not uncommon to see the move bishop c4, placing pressure against f7, but white needs to be careful after black castles, securing the king as well as defending the f7 pawn with the rook, which now sets up a small positional trap. It's all too easy to continue on autopilot and simply castle, but this allows the instructive center knight fork trick with knight takes e4, capturing a pawn while luring white's knight to the e4 square, preparing the fork d5. It's better for white to preserve the light-squared bishop, so after bishop d3, black regains the piece with d takes e4, bishop takes e4. White's two-pawn center has been compromised while black's dark-squared bishop comes to life on the long diagonal, adding pressure against the d4 pawn, a key target in the Pirc defense. This is by no means the end of the world for white, especially as d4 can be reinforced with c3. That being said, black should not experience any serious difficulties out of the opening, and one strong plan is to play knight d7, preparing the possible pawn break e5, or the more dynamic choice c5, attacking the d4 pawn without restricting the dark-squared bishop. After black castles, white needs to stay alert for knight takes e4 tricks. One way to deal with this threat is bishop b3, removing the bishop from central forking distance, or white may decide to protect the e4 pawn with queen e2, preventing knight takes e4, as white will simply recapture with the queen. Centralizing the queen also prepares the possibility of a double-edged pawn advance to e5. We can see the clash between white's classical approach of occupying the center with two pawns, versus black's hypermodern approach of counterattacking from the flanks with bishop g4. Pinning the knight, a key defender of white's center. White may decide to claim the bishop pair with h3, when black will play bishop takes f3, followed by attacking d4 with knight c6, leading to an interesting positional struggle. If white would prefer to challenge black directly, then we can explore the double-edged advance e5, mobilizing white's central pawns, invading black's territory. Black's position is put to the test after d takes e5, d takes e5, opening up the d-file, followed by knight f to d7. Black's pieces dance around white's center, and now that e5 is under serious pressure, white should march forward with e6. At first glance, black's position looks terrible. and if black responds passively, this impression will prove correct. The knight is under attack, and white is also threatening to capture the pawn on f7. Things are not so simple, however, as not only does black's dark-squared bishop enjoy activity down the long diagonal, thanks to the pin on f3, black can stay in the game with the tactical resource knight e5, attacking white's pin knight on f3, as well as the light-squared bishop. White continues with the forcing e takes f7 check. Self-pinning the knight with knight takes f7 isn't exactly a desirable choice, so black's king simply steps to the side. White is up a pawn for the time being, but the pawn on f7 will be difficult to maintain. To better understand the direction of play, let's briefly follow a high-level encounter. Grandmaster Daniil Dubov activated his dark-squared bishop with bishop e3. Knight takes c4 does not solve black's opening problems, as queen takes c4 activates the queen, supporting f7, as well as attacking the light-squared bishop. His opponent, Grandmaster Alexander Morosevich, maintained the tension and activated the last minor piece with knight b to c6, supporting the knight while also eyeing the d4 square. White exploited the open d file with rook d1, when black's queen stepped to the side with queen c8, escaping the attack from the rook while eyeing the f5 square. White continued with bishop d5, adding pressure against the queen side while supporting the pin knight on f3. The struggle intensifies after queen f5, adding another attacker against the pin knight, as well as increasing the pressure against f7. Now that the queen has cleared the back rank, black is ready to fight for the open d-file with rook a to d8, adding pressure against the light-squared bishop. So white decided to centralize his bishop while challenging black's queen with bishop e4. In the game, black decided to play queen h5, when white took advantage of the newly opened d5 square with knight d5, attacking the weak c7 pawn, creating serious pressure against black's position. The instructive queen maneuver could have been improved by accepting white's invitation to regain the pawn with queen takes f7, clearing the f-file for the newly created queen-rook battery. The queen is also well prepared to meet knight d5, as e6 attacks the knight while revealing the queen's protection of the c7 pawn. A stronger path for white is to challenge black's queen with knight g5. White's queen is also in danger, but white will gladly accept the bishop pair after bishop takes e2 and knight takes f7 check. So black can offer a more favorable exchange of queens from the c4 square, leading to a complex middle game after white increases the tension with f3, supporting the center while attacking the light-squared bishop. The Pirc was placed under early pressure based upon white advancing the central pawns into enemy territory, but with proper play, this can lead to complex, double-edged positions with mutual chances, one of the main objectives when playing the Pirc. Bishop c4 can lead to sharp, forcing lines with interesting play to examine. A more modest, but positionally testing option is bishop e2. White solidly develops the bishop while preparing kingside castling. This is known as the classical variation. White is content with maintaining a central space advantage and will try to make black's life difficult in preventing active counterplay. The game typically continues with both sides castling kingside. We reach a critical moment in the opening. How exactly should black generate counterplay? Bishop g4 often results in surrendering the bishop pair, and it's well met by bishop e3, supporting the center while preparing to build a queen-bishop battery with queen d2, pointing toward black's castled kingside. The provocative knight c6 is possible, although white should not be afraid to grab more space with d5, challenging black to find sufficient counterplay. Striking against white's center with c5 can also be examined, allowing the space-gaining d5. Provoking this pawn advance does loosen some dark squares on the long diagonal, but white enjoys a comfortable space advantage, transposing into a favorable Benoni position for white that typically arises from d4 being played on the first move. This leaves us with a6, or the most popular reply, c6. In addition to a6, this pawn move suggests the possibility of gaining more space on the queen side with b5, creating the option to play b4, removing the guard for white's e4 pawn. White is by no means forced to prevent b5, and may consider moves such as bishop f4 or rook e1. But white's most popular choice is to grab space on the queen side with a4, restricting black's options as this discourages b5. Unlike a6, moving the pawn to c6 has some unique features. It does restrict black's queenside knight, but c6 opens up the c7 square for the queen when it's prepared to join the knight after knight b to d7 in supporting the e5 pawn break. This was exactly the plan implemented by world champion Magnus Carlsen, starting with knight b to d7. His opponent, Grandmaster Yu Yangyi, continued to squeeze black on the queen side with a5, controlling the b6 square and suggesting a possible undermining a6 pawn advance if it proves desirable in the future. Magnus continued with his plan by playing queen c7, preparing to strike in the center with e5. White anticipated this pawn break by first playing h3, securing the g4 square so White's dark-squared bishop can comfortably support the center with bishop e3. Black executed his desired pawn break with e5, adding pressure against White's center. If White decides to resolve the tension with d5, not only does this allow Black to open up the c-file with c takes d5, it also creates the option of knight c5, adding pressure against White's e4 pawn. In response to e5, Grandmaster Yu Yangyi preferred to maintain the tension with bishop e3. Black's light-squared bishop still needs to figure out how to enter the game, which may take some time into the middle game before a clear direction is revealed. One path to consider is e takes d4, preparing to exert pressure down the e-file with rook e8. In this case, the f8 square would be open, allowing a future knight f8, which not only allows a possible knight e6, it also supports activating the bishop with bishop e6. It's also possible to maintain the central tension with rook e8, as was played by Grandmaster Carlsen. In this case, White can clarify the tension in the center with d takes e5, trying to fix a black pawn on e5 to restrict the enemy dark-squared bishop. White may also seek to improve the position of the light-squared bishop with bishop c4, a common theme in the classical variation, which was the preference of Grandmaster Yu Yangyi. This led to an interesting positional struggle in which the game was eventually drawn. The classical approach with knight f3 is a solid, straightforward way to handle the Pirc and Modern defenses. The knight does block the f-pawn, so delaying the development of this knight allows some more aggressive, double-edged options. Moving the pawn to f3, supporting the center, may be associated with the aggressive plan of bishop e3, queen d2, and castling queenside, a sharp option that has similarities to the Yugoslav attack in the Sicilian Dragon. The f3 pawn may also support a future kingside pawn storm with g4 and h4. In response to White's likely plan of castling queenside, Black may prepare counterplay on that side of the board with a6 and b5, leading to sharp, double-edged play. Moving the pawn to f3 is definitely worth exploring. However, White's most ambitious approach is to claim more central space with f4. Turning the game into the Austrian attack, White seeks to maximize the central space advantage, preparing to build a dangerous central and kingside attack. The f4 pawn helps support e5, which would greatly restrict Black's dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Black continues with the typical kingside fianchetto. A critical question to answer is if White can get away with the ambitious pawn advance e5. This desirable move is considered somewhat premature, but Black must understand how to handle this aggressive lunge. D takes e5 is one reasonable path, preparing to exchange queens if White plays d takes e5. And if White decides to capture with the f-pawn, this is well met by knight d5, preparing to strike against White's center with c5. Another promising path is to maintain the tension in the center with knight f to d7. This knight retreat suddenly creates 3 attackers against White's central spearhead on e5. White typically reinforces the center with knight f3. When we see a clash of opening philosophies take center stage after the important counterstrike, c5. White occupies a large center, but in so doing, Black counterattacks this massive center from a distance, preparing to chip away at it with c takes d4, strengthening the potential of Black's dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal. Practice has demonstrated Black is doing just fine, so playing e5 too early does not promise White anything special. Since the space-gaining e5 is a double-edged decision that does not currently favor White, the mainline continuation is to actively develop behind the central pawn mass with knight f3, allowing Black to castle. e5 transposes to the position we briefly introduced with knight f to d7, and now that Black is castled, this allows the additional option of knight e8 if it proves desirable. Understanding where to develop the light-squared bishop is essential for White. The natural, as well as dubious bishop c4 allows the now familiar center knight fork trick with knight takes e4, preparing to meet knight takes e4 by forking the knight and bishop with d5. A more modest way for the bishop to enter the game is from e2. It's important for black to energetically challenge white's broad center, so a strong choice is c5, creating immediate pressure against white's central d-pawn, preparing c takes d4 if allowed. d5 should be met by e6, building sharp counterplay against white's center. White's most popular response is to open the d-file with d takes c5. The main point behind playing c5 is revealed after the active counter queen a5, pinning the knight on c3, and since the light-squared bishop does not protect e4, knight takes e4 is in the air. White should return the pawn by castling, allowing queen takes c5 check, leading to roughly balanced chances. The greedy approach of capturing pawns with c takes d6 simply brings black's position to life, starting with knight takes e4, awakening black's dark-squared bishop, increasing the pressure against the pinned knight on c3. After d takes e7, the rook calmly shifts to the e8 square. The pawn on e7 will soon be collected, opening the e-file for black's rook. Knight takes c3 remains a serious threat when white's position is under tremendous pressure. Bishop e2 is a reasonable move as long as white doesn't try to win material after c5, but a more challenging approach is to activate the bishop on the d3 square, supporting the e4 pawn, which takes the sting out of black's counterplay with c5. Now that the bishop is on d3, white can simply play d takes c5. In this case, the plan of queen a5 followed by knight takes e4 is no longer an option. So after d takes c5, if black decides to capture the pawn, this is well met by e5, when black will have issues generating sufficient counterplay. Knight a6, preparing c5 is one interesting option to explore. The other popular choice is to centralize the knight with knight c6, adding pressure against white's center while preparing the important pawn break e5. If white lunges forward with d5, then black has the strong reply knight b4, attacking the light-squared bishop and preparing to challenge white's advanced d5 pawn with c6. In response to knight c6, castling is an interesting option when black can strike in the center with e5, setting the stage for a complicated struggle. White's most critical test is to prevent black's idea by claiming the e5 square. White is prepared to meet a move such as knight fd7 by centralizing the knight on the newly vacated e4 square, adding pressure in the center while also eyeing the g5 square, preparing to support a well-timed kingside attack. In response to e5, black should play d takes e5, opening up the d-file for black's queen. D takes e5 is considered less critical, allowing black to centralize the knight with knight d5, leading to a solid, if not especially challenging position for white. A more testing reply is f takes e5, opening up the f-file, which may later benefit a rook on f1. Capturing with the f-pawn does leave the d-pawn somewhat vulnerable, leading to interesting complications. Unlike d takes e5, removing the possibility of creating a strong central pawn chain, when black is able to comfortably centralize the knight with knight d5. By capturing with the f-pawn, knight d5 is no longer a desirable choice for black. If black decides to play knight d5 anyway, this allows the favorable exchange knight takes d5, queen takes d5. Trading knights allows white to secure the center with c3. The d4 pawn is no longer vulnerable, and white is ready to play queen e2, possibly chasing the queen away with bishop e4, when black lacks sufficient counterplay against white's comfortable central space advantage. When white captures on e5 with the f-pawn, black does not want to allow white to build a comfortable central pawn chain with an eventual c3. So instead of knight d5, the most popular response is knight h5. Moving the knight to the edge of the board doesn't look too attractive, but black's dark-squared bishop adds additional pressure against white's pawn on e5, which also prepares an important pawn break with f6. Black's queen and other knight also add pressure against d4, so white reinforces the sensitive d4 pawn while activating the dark-squared bishop with bishop e3. In order to stay afloat, black must play energetically, so a strong choice is bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, indirectly adding pressure against the d4 pawn it's trying to support. White spends a tempo to relieve some of the central pressure with bishop e2. unpinning the knight while revealing the queen's protection of the d4 pawn. If black doesn't act quickly, white can play moves such as knight e4, increasing control over the center and kingside, followed by queen d2, building a dangerous queen-bishop battery when white may decide to castle on either side of the board with a comfortable game. So it's important for black to play the instructive pawn break f6, attacking the e5 pawn 3 times. If white decides to relieve the tension and play for tricks with e6, hoping that black will blunder by capturing the pawn, allowing the fork d5. This is well met by f5, liberating the dark squared bishop on the long diagonal, adding serious pressure against white's center. In this case, the pawn on e6 will more likely prove to be a liability than an asset. Since the e5 pawn is under tremendous pressure, white typically resolves the tension with e takes f6. Knight takes f6 is perfectly playable, although this capture does create an isolated pawn on the e-file. So black typically responds with e takes f6, setting the stage for a complex middle game struggle. White's pawn on d4 remains a double-edged element. It does enjoy central control, but it also remains a serious target for black's pieces. Advancing the pawn with d5 is one option to explore, when black has the strong reply queen e7, attacking the unprotected dark squared bishop, preparing to then centralize the knight on e5, leading to sharp play. Castling kingside is also a reasonable choice, and white may decide to play queen d2, followed by adding another imbalance in the position by castling queenside. Now that the e-file's been opened after e takes f6, black will likely play rook e8, adding pressure against white's position. And another common maneuver to keep in mind is knight e7, preparing to jump into the f5 square, adding pressure against white's center and dark squared bishop. There's plenty of scope for original play in the Austrian attack, favoring the better prepared and more experienced player. The Pirc defense focuses on restraining the e-pawn with d6, followed by attacking it with knight f6 on the next move. White typically defends the e4 pawn with knight c3, a strong choice, but it does slightly restrict white's options. The modern defense is a more flexible, initially less confrontational choice, starting with g6, preparing to meet d4, with bishop g7, creating pressure down the long diagonal, but since there is no immediate danger in the center, white is granted additional flexibility. One choice is to grab more central space with c4, inviting a transposition into the king's Indian defense after d6, knight c3, and knight f6, a sharp, counter-attacking response when white opens the game with d4 on the first move. If white wants to keep the game in e4 territory, two interesting choices include knight f3 and knight c3. Let's see where the Pirc and Modern often meet after the popular continuation knight c3. When black plays the typical d6, just like in the Pirc, white's most ambitious choice against the modern is to play f4, inviting black to transpose into the Pirc after knight f6, an invitation that is typically accepted. If black truly wants to live on the edge, then a6 is a risky option, trying to keep the game in modern territory. Another interesting choice for white is to play bishop e3, supporting the center and often preparing queen d2, followed by queenside castling, an aggressive idea we mentioned in the Pirc. Of course, black always has the option to consider knight f6, turning the game into Pirc territory. If black would prefer to play in modern style, not only is c6 one interesting option to explore, black's most common approach is to play a6. The modern is a provocative opening in which black often falls behind in development, but a6 is not a random move. It prepares queenside counterplay with b5, not only preparing a possible queenside fianchetto, but also waiting for a timely moment to grab more space on the queenside and strike against white's center with c5. Against a6 or c6, just like in the Pirc, white has the option to play a4, restraining black's ideas of playing b5. In this case, black may settle for b6, preparing a queenside fianchetto and likely striking against white's center with a future c5. A more aggressive approach is to simply ignore black's plans and continue with the aggressive queen d2, creating a queen-bishop battery pointing toward black's kingside. White is also prepared to sharpen the game by castling queenside. The struggle intensifies after b5, grabbing queenside space when white is faced with an important decision. The more positional a4 is still an option, adding pressure against b5 and preparing to meet a possible b4 with knight d5. Suggesting black's queenside demonstration may prove overextended. On the other hand, white can embrace the complications and castle. White is not afraid of b4. Not only can white play knight d5, it's also possible to play knight c to e2, revealing the queen's attack against the b4 pawn, when white is prepared to attack on the king side with f3 and g4. Instead of the premature b4, black may decide to play knight d7, preparing to strike in the center with c5, or immediately fianchetto the light-squared bishop with bishop b7. Both of black's bishops point toward the center, exerting pressure against white's pawn duo. This is a good moment to reinforce the center with f3, while also preparing a kingside pawn storm with g4 and h4. Black typically continues with knight d7. Unlike the Pircs, it's common in the modern to delay the development of the kingside knight. This allows black's dark-squared bishop to maintain pressure down the long diagonal. Black remains patient regarding where to develop the knight, deciding whether it best belongs on f6, e7, or even some cases h6. Now that the center is secure for the time being, white focuses on the king side with h4, threatening to invade black's territory with h5, using the g6 pawn as a hook to tear open the king side. h6 is one possible response, preparing to meet h5 with g5. Committing the pawn to h6 may make this a long-term positional target for white, as the queen-bishop battery points directly at this square. The most common response, however, is to stop the h-pawn in its tracks with h5, weakening the g5 square, and now the g6 pawn can only rely upon the f7 pawn to support it. After softening the king side, white's knight can enter the action from the h3 square. This may not look like an impressive entrance into the game, but the knight is well positioned to either place pressure against f7 with knight g5, or increase control over the center while exerting pressure against black's kingside structure with knight f4. The knight on d7 is well positioned to support c5, grabbing space on the queen side while joining the dark-squared bishop and adding pressure against the d4 pawn. In response, white typically captures the pawn with d takes c5, clearing part of the d-file for white's queen-rook battery. As white seeks to open the position, black typically prefers capturing with the knight, which also clears the c-file for a future rook c8 and possible queen c7, exerting pressure against white's castled structure. Exchanging white's d-pawn for black's c5 pawn has resulted in a Sicilian defense structure, so it's no surprise that this sets the stage for complex, double-edged play. We see a sharp middle game struggle develop after knight g5, adding pressure against the vulnerable f7 pawn. This annoying knight isn't easy to dislodge, as f6 would critically weaken black's kingside. By adding pressure against f7, black has to stay alert for the threat of bishop takes c5, because after d takes c5, followed by exchanging major pieces on the d-file, black's king cannot both defend the f7 pawn, as well as capture on d8 when necessary, so black's position would fall apart. With this in mind, a good response for black is to support the knight with rook c8. Black's knight on g8 has remained patient, but white may force black to declare intentions on the king side with bishop d4. Challenging black's dark-squared bishop, the key defender of the king side, an important source of counterplay against white's queen side. Although exchanging bishops is possible, black typically avoids this exchange and awakens the knight from its slumber with knight f6. We have reached a typical position in the modern. White enjoys more central space with an active position. Black's king has remained flexible in the center, but as the center may quickly open, black may have to commit it to the king side by castling. The position is filled with tension, and although white may enjoy the more comfortable game, black is certainly not without counterplay. Ideas such as queen c7, preparing to add pressure down the c-file is one possibility, and black may also consider the maneuver knight c to d7, preparing to centralize the knight on the e5 square, when the knight may be prepared to leap into the c4 square, provoking interesting complications. White will not simply wait to see all of these moves appear on the board. Moving the king away from the c-file with king b1 is one interesting option, and white may decide to play more directly with knight d5, intensifying the pressure against the pinned knight on f6. This move also invites black to surrender the bishop pair with bishop takes d5, opening up the e-file after e takes d5. Knight c3 is an active option against the modern, but unlike the Pircs, since black hasn't placed pressure against the e4 pawn with knight f6, Another flexible option is knight f3. When after d6, in addition to the natural knight c3, white has a variety of options to explore. White may decide to play the solid c3, supporting the center while restricting the enemy dark-squared bishop. Another option is to activate the light-squared bishop with bishop c4, placing serious pressure against the f7 pawn. In the modern, black's queenside knight often enters the game from d7, supporting the thematic counterstrike c5. In this case, playing knight d7 would be a serious mistake, falling into a well-known trap, allowing white to win a pawn while destroying black's kingside with bishop takes f7 check. The light-squared bishop is immune from capture, as king takes f7 allows the crushing shot knight g5 check. King f6 allows mate in 1 with queen f3. King f8 stumbles into the fork knight e6, winning the queen. And if the king returns to e8, this embarrasses black's queen after knight e6. The queen is entombed by its own pieces. The modern stretches the possibilities of opening play, but even this adventurous opening must have its limitations. Instead of blundering with knight d7, black may attempt knight f6, inviting a transposition into the Pirc, but since black did not use the typical Pirc move order, provoking knight c3, white has the strong response queen e2, where white may decide to play c3, reinforcing the d4 pawn. Another popular modern setup is e6, restricting white's light-squared bishop and preparing a future pawn break in the center. So a good prophylactic measure is bishop b3. Now that the bishop is no longer on c4, d5 does not gain a tempo, allowing white to grab more space in the center with e5, restricting the dark-squared bishop, while cementing black's pawn on e6, restricting the other bishop on c8. Moving the pawn to e6 allows black to play knight e7, developing the knight without blocking the dark-squared bishop. White can respond by solidifying the center with c3, building a strong dark-squared pawn chain, restricting black's modern bishop on g7. In one high-level encounter, Grandmaster Levon Aronian continued with b6, preparing to fianchetto the other bishop. His opponent, Grandmaster Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, demonstrated a solid path for white, starting with castling, preparing to meet bishop b7, attacking the unprotected e4 pawn with rook e1, supporting the pawn while centralizing the rook, also preparing an instructive knight maneuver typically seen in the Ruy Lopez. Black's other knight enters the game with knight d7. This unusual setup is known as the hippopotamus defense, especially if black includes the moves a6 and h6, trying to restrict white's ability to invade black's territory. This rather strange-looking setup attempts to provoke white into prematurely attacking black's position when black may suddenly find strong counterplay. White demonstrates great patience, avoiding prematurely advancing the center pawns. Notice white's pawn duo restricts the active squares for black's knights. MVL improves the position of his pieces, starting with the instructive maneuver knight b to d2. White doesn't really mind how black may continue, preparing to activate the knight on the king side via f1 to g3, enjoying a comfortable space advantage while black's position remains quite cramped. Although some hippo players like to lie in the weeds with a6, possibly preparing b5, as well as h6, allowing black's king to remain in the center. Grandmaster Aronian decided to castle. White continued the plan with knight f1, when black intensified the pressure against white's center with c5. White remained patient, not minding an exchange of pawns, and simply improved his knight with knight g3. Grandmaster Aronian prepared possible counterplay on the queen side with queen c7, connecting the rooks, preparing to meet bishop g5, attacking the newly unprotected e7 knight with knight c6. White's knights do an excellent job supporting the center, so white continues to build pressure with queen d2, building a queen-bishop battery, preparing bishop h6, intending to exchange black's important dark-squared bishop. White is ready to centralize the other rook on d1, when white enjoys more space, and behind this space, more active pieces. The knight on g3 may also support a kingside initiative with h4 and h5, adding serious pressure against black's kingside. Black may try to build pressure on the queen side with rook a to c8, preparing to open the c-file with c takes d4 at some point, and black may also try to attack white's light-squared bishop with knight a5, suddenly eyeing the c4 square if white decides to retreat the light-squared bishop. White's patient play, avoiding lashing out too quickly with a d5 or e5 pawn break, weakening some squares left behind, allowing black to generate counterplay, has resulted in a comfortable game for white. MVL went on to convert this favorable position into victory. The Pircs with knight f6, or delaying the development of the kingside knight with the modern, both share a common kingside fianchetto. These hypermodern defenses allow white to place 2 or more pawns in the center, claiming a space advantage, in order to counterattack white's central occupation from the flanks. If black doesn't play carefully, white can use the space advantage to positionally squeeze black, or try to accelerate development and build a dangerous attack against black's underdeveloped forces. This is a serious risk, but with proper play, black can generate sharp counterplay to keep the game complicated. This is why these somewhat risky openings are sometimes used in must-win situations, as the resulting middle games typically produce plenty of imbalances for both sides to examine. Thanks for exploring the Pirc and Modern defenses, and best of luck the next time you join the debate between white's space advantage and active piece play versus black's ability to pressure the center from the flanks, seeking counter chances within the complications.